Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be tuning in from. Welcome to day 2 of the Open Web Forum at CogX, curated by Fabric Ventures. I'm Ian, and I'll be your MC for today. Coming up in the agenda, we start with back-to-back decentralized finance panels at 10 and 11. The first is a star-studded lineup on market opportunity. The second, an in-depth look into one of the most essential components of DeFi, stablecoins. At 12, we'll explore how protocols can incentivize productive governance participation from a new type of individual, the so-called full-time token holder. Then after lunch, Ilya Zinchenko of Entropy Network will tell us all about the road to a scalable data network across organizations. At 3, we'll tackle the persistent issue of how to onboard the new developers to the open web. After that, Sasha Hudzilin, co-creator of Human Guild, will explain how community-owned gig worker platforms can partially alleviate poverty while teaching people valuable skills in the process. Then at 5, one for all the digital art collectors out there, it's the market opportunity of NFT art. Finally at 6, we'll round out the day with a different form of art in music and how the open web is revolutionizing this Luddite industry and empowering artists everywhere. But first up is DeFi, market opportunity. Now the billions of dollars are settled daily and protocols have proved resilient to potentially catastrophic market shocks. How long will it be until all the finance is consumed? Moderating this one is Tamlyn Rudolph, co-creator and protocol designer of Vega, the decentralized derivatives market. Tamlyn has 15 years of commodities and derivatives trading experience, so I think it's safe to say she knows a thing or two about financial markets. Over to you, Tamlyn.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Very delighted to be here today, talking about such a really interesting topic, really something very close to my heart, which is exploring really the future of financial systems. We have an absolutely stellar group of thought leaders here today who've been working for years on the cutting edge of these systems. So welcome, speakers. Thank you for taking time out of building and operating to reflect on DeFi's market opportunity. So to kick things off, I wanted to reflect that the decentralization of finance really began with Bitcoin. But in more recent years, many projects have been tackling how to layer onto this other financial services such as credit, lending, exchange, insurance, stable coins, as mentioned, and even liquidity as a service, so that these financial services can operate in a fully decentralized, permissionless way. The sector has grown. I think it was about a year ago, it was roughly around about $1 billion that was placed at risk in these DeFi protocols. And that peaked up to almost 90 billion in May this year. It's sitting at around 60 billion. And much of this has been channeled through Ethereum-based protocols, but unsurprisingly, given the growth and expansion, we've recently seen a wealth of new chains and new capital flowing into the system. Solana Labs recently raised 314 mil to build out DeFi on Solana. We've seen Peter Thiel enter the scene, joining a 300 mil round to build out DeFi on EOS. And so I think it's quite clear that DeFi is no longer a niche area of geeky experimentation that was a few years ago when I sort of joined in. And in fact, I think the moment that really hit home for me was late last year when Lindsay Lohan referred to DeFi in the tweet. So today's panel, we're going to speak to you about the market opportunities that DeFi opens up. We'll lay some foundations so that you can understand why DeFi is more exciting than simply having computerized access to your bank account or an app to easily trade via your phone. We'll discuss the bigger picture implications of how DeFi may interact with other emerging tech, and we'll touch on challenges that the DeFi ecosystem faces in its growth journey in terms of security and governance of the protocols. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to this exceptional panel to introduce himself. Each of these speakers has more than 15 years experience across traditional finance, crypto exchanges, blockchain adoption and growth projects, DeFi building and innovation and entrepreneurship. I'll call on each of them to introduce themselves, and I actually recently had to answer this question to my niece, so I thought I'd lay the challenge to them as well, to how would they describe what they do to a 5-year-old. So I'll kick off by inviting Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be today with all the stellar panelists. My name is Vanessa Grellet. I'm the head of portfolio growth at CoinFund, which is a VC and hedge fund that focuses on crypto. We've been investing since 2015. Prior to joining CoinFund, I worked for almost 5 years at Consensus, working mostly with large enterprise to drive adoption, but also with all our products like MetaMask and other DeFi-related projects. And prior to that, I worked 15 years in market infrastructure and financial services, notably for the New York Stock Exchange. So did you want me to answer like what DeFi means, or where do I see it going?
Sorry, apologies for that. I just needed to plug in headphones. Can everyone hear me okay now? Great. Yeah, Vanessa, I think the challenge was, how would you describe what you do to a 5-year-old, or DeFi itself to a 5-year-old?
So DeFi allows you to do basically what the big banks and asset managers were allowed to do using leverage, creating additional yield through mechanisms that are now decentralized, but that were not accessible to retail investors and other investors if they were not accessing the capital markets in a very specific way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super exciting. Josh, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for having me. My name's Josh Goodbody. I'm the COO for Qredo. My background is very much financial markets and traditional finance. I spent most of my career as a financial markets, derivatives and commodities lawyer in London. I entered the crypto space in 2017 to join Huobi Global as their general counsel. I was with Huobi for 2 years, helping internationalize their business, helped launch their institutional business there as well for the first wave of corporates and institutions joining the space. More recently, for the past 1.5 years, I've been leading the Europe, Middle East and Africa region for the Binance Group. I was with Binance for a 1.5 years, and I joined Qredo, which is a decentralized custodial and settlement layer 2 network, about 2 months ago. So it's a pleasure to be here. Now, I like the question you asked, which is how would you describe what we do to a 5-year-old? And I think in the most simple terms, I would try and describe it as putting lots of building blocks together and building some really cool products and services for people to make finance better and more accessible to the average person.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Over to you, Jack.
Hi, good morning or evening, everyone. My name is Jack McDonald. I'm the CEO of PolySign. PolySign is a 3-year-old company. We're a enterprise-grade blockchain infrastructure company focusing on custody and settlement. We're regulated in the United States, specifically by the New York Department of Financial Services, and just in the process now of launching our business. To your question as to how I describe DeFi to a 5-year-old, I'm often asked to describe that to my older relatives, and so it's maybe a similar sort of audience. And I think about specifically on the custody side, the core focus is just keeping assets safe, and the changing nature of digital assets is very different than traditional assets. I come from a traditional finance background, similar to some of the other panelists, and we just focus on security and also the smooth transfer of wealth between different parties.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think everyone can sort of relate to keeping things safe, for sure. Martin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Martin Quensel, co-founder of Centrifuge. Yeah, I had a few startups before, so I think started in 2000 with my first startup, had an origin in software development, and then moved over more and more into the business side of things. So with Centrifuge, I'm focusing more on business rather developing decentralized code. What the Centrifuge is doing is we are connecting what DeFi, has created for the crypto world and all the financial instruments. And I think already mentioned here, connecting that with the real world. Where in the real world, every one of us is using the traditional financial system, has a bank account, etc. And if it comes to businesses, go to a bank for credit or a commercial loan, actually replacing this with a decentralized infrastructure and connecting it to decentralized finance. So this infrastructure connecting the real world with DeFi, that's what we are doing.
Brilliant, thanks, Martin. Yeah, I've been watching Centrifuge for a while. I'm very excited by what you guys are up to as well. And finally, Kane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kane from Synthetix. Synthetix is a synthetic asset platform on Ethereum. So we allow people to hold tokens that give them exposure to a range of different assets. So Bitcoin, other high market cap assets, as well as things like oil, traditional equities, and a range of other assets and indexes.
Great. And so just staying with you, Kane, I was wondering if to kick off this session, we could get you to illuminate for our audience what the major technological leaps have been that have made DeFi technically possible. And also following from that, sort of what, the biggest sort of socio-technical hurdles that DeFi builders are currently facing as well.
I think the current iteration of DeFi has obviously emerged out of Ethereum. So there were some early experiments that were sort of pseudo DeFi, stable coins and things like that, in 2015, 2016. But kind of the current generation of DeFi systems, probably starting with like MakerDAO and DAI, and then on to things like Uniswap and Aave and Compound and all the things we know today, really emerged out of like 2017, 2018 Ethereum. And I think part of the reason why it took that long for these, fairly complex smart contract suites to emerge is that the tooling on Ethereum for a long time was, not really there. So we had this platform that could do all these cool things, but it was still quite difficult to develop. And I think another component, which has certainly accelerated over the last probably 12 to 18 months, was that governance was really challenging. And so, if you wanted to build something, you kind of had to go the route that, say, Augur took, where, you spent 2 years, building something that was designed to be, completely immutable, unchangeable, and then released it. And I think what we've sort of seen is that, most of the DeFi projects today that have done fairly well have taken an approach, probably Uniswap is one of the few that's that kind of runs counter to this, but they've taken an approach of kind of iterative development and releasing a protocol and then upgrading it over time. But those upgrades obviously require some form of governance on top of it. And I think the governance infrastructure really only emerged in the last sort of 12 months. So I think that's why we're starting to see more complexity, arise in the DeFi ecosystem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was actually just recently reading a paper by Carlota Perez. It's from 2009, and it was titled Technological Revolutions and Techno-Economic Paradigms. And she was making the point that sort of the space of the technologically possible is much greater than of the economically profitable and socially acceptable, and that entrepreneurs are constantly, turning technical possibilities into economic realities. And she argues that although it's true that major innovations have a central role in determining new investment and economic growth, that actual expansion depends on incremental innovation. And Vanessa, from at CoinFund and previously Consensus, I'm sure you've had a huge wealth of direct experience working with entrepreneurs, and you're obviously very involved in DeFi at this critical point. Does this resonate with you? Does the idea that DeFi is a major innovation, but that the expansion will depend on incremental innovation, seem like a sort of a thesis you would agree with?
Totally. I mean, I think since the beginning of Ethereum, it has been like that. People building, innovating, iterating. Not all, companies will have a sound business model in the traditional sense, But I think, with token economics and incentivization schemes and DAOs, we will find other ways to innovate in the open source world. And I think that's what's really exciting. So at CoinFund, we're trying to invest in sort of the building blocks of that, whether it's governance or DAOs or other infrastructure that allow for the flourishing of this innovation and securing the infrastructure. I think, there's going to be several iterations, and it will grow exponentially in the future thanks to those building blocks. So we're pretty excited about this vision, and what you've just said. Sometimes, economically viable is not aligned with innovation, but I think in the context of decentralized networks and cryptocurrency, there's a different perspective and scope about value creation, and I think that's the mindset we need to get into when we invest and how we see the world evolving in terms of open source value creation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do any of the other speakers want to add their thoughts to that?
I was just thinking, though, it's a very interesting point, and the amount and the speed and breadth of innovation is really incredible in decentralized finance. And I was just thinking about the contrast of traditional finance, and one of the factors that may be at play here is that in traditional finance, to really innovate and bring a product to market, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, you needed to go through certain regulatory hurdles. And so that there was a bit of a governor on that innovation. And now if you think about a world where the regulatory environment is much less prevalent, it really opens the gate for much greater innovation and exploration, which in many ways is a phenomenal, great thing. It makes it challenging and candidly sometimes to follow it and keep track of all the different directions that DeFi is pushing. I think on balance, I'm sure all the panelists would agree, it's a very positive development for finance and the democratization of access to financial services. But it is very different than the way we've grown up in the traditional finance business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also ties back to, there's the Austrian economist, I apologize, I've only ever read his name, Schumpeter. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, apologies. But he was known for his observations on, industrial innovation cycles. And he noted that the great importance of entrepreneurs having access to credit as a sort of vital driving force, because it enables them to experiment and, disrupt the equilibrium and so forth. And what I'm wondering, and it ties a little bit to what you were just saying, Jack, as well, is like the magic of DeFi, as you point out, is that ability to sort of innovate without going through a lot of red tape, but also this access to credit. Makes me wonder, are we actually on the brink of empowering this kind of quite vast human innovation by extending this capital access to people who've, just to a far, far greater number of people? And I wondered, Martin, if you had any thoughts on that, because obviously you guys think quite a lot about sort of bridging the world, the real world and the DeFi world.
Yeah, the power of DeFi, I think, is really it's something you start to explore, I think, and no one knows where it's going. I think if you compare traditional fintech that was more or less focusing on digitizing traditional finance processes, automate them, but right now with DeFi, the ability actually to decentralize things, which comes with the ability to kind of decompose stuff, focus on specific areas, and then compose it in a completely new way. That will create a lot of business models, I think we are just not really aware of, So, and you see a few working, a few more will evolve, and where it will go to, how long it will take, no one really knows. But so we are still very, very early. That's what I'm saying, And for us a little bit, there, I think Synthetix, you have really much more something that you can combine. Actually, the power of its existing composables in the DeFi ecosystem be pretty much as a bridge to, let's say, the real world. You mentioned, also companies with I think limited access to financing, emerging markets, impact financing, etc. And also, opening up this unlocks those for DeFi or vice versa. That comes up with a lot of, Jack, you mentioned it. I think legal challenges. There in the real world, you have some assets you might want to finance. We would like to have a claim on a collateral, equity of a company, invoices, inventory you finance, a trade you finance, etc. And there is an existing legal framework, and then connecting it with this open, rather gray space of DeFi. That is of course a challenge. So as I think you're a little bit in between, traditional finance plus DeFi, and that takes all a little bit longer, I guess, and a bit more complex. Where I think projects really focusing on DeFi itself, solving first issues for crypto and crypto holders is maybe easier, and that's also where the innovation is coming from. I think if you look at it, there's a space moving fast that is really crypto takes care of crypto, and we will first building financial tools for crypto and crypto holders and the crypto community itself.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I completely agree with it being early days, and I tend to see a narrative shine through quite a lot about DeFi eating the current financial system. And Josh, this is a question for you. Like, when you think about the market opportunities for the decentralization of finance, are you thinking about that kind of narrative, or are you thinking about sort of finding the new business models that probably haven't been understood, new addressable markets potentially, or a bit of both? Yeah,
well, I think a bit of both. So the way that I see it at the moment is we're all wearing our training wheels. So we're still learning, how to navigate the space. As Jack said, it moves so quickly, and all these new potential use cases and benefits of DeFi are discovered, on a monthly basis. So we're all learning, we're all experimenting, and will DeFi eat the traditional finance space? I firmly believe so. When that will happen is another question. Will it be in 10 years, 20 years? Will we stop referring to DeFi as DeFi and just call it Fi? Will it be finance in the future? I think so. We're in the very, very early stages of this kind of innovation cycle. And what you're seeing in this is people, learning and failing very quickly, which I think is a good thing. Obviously not when it's at the expense of the consumer, but people are understanding what can and can't be built well right now. People are innovating equally quickly, and one of the really encouraging things about DeFi is the open and accessibility to innovation that decentralized finance is bringing, and people from everywhere can start contributing and get involved on Twitter or Discord or wherever they may be contributing. And they would never have the ability to be a stakeholder with a voice in the traditional financial system. They would never be able to chime in and contribute, something that may be of use to them and their community in their probably underbanked community somewhere in their developing nation. DeFi completely changes that. Everyone is an equal stakeholder in terms of getting their voice across. And I think that starts to resonate with people. And of course, there will be challenges where we have to bridge what we're building in this sandbox with the traditional space, especially around licensing and regulation and how that fits in with the rapid chase of innovation. There will always be a friction point between the two. But I very much believe that, we are innovating to the point where people can't ignore what's being done in the DeFi sector anymore. And this really kind of disintermediation we're seeing brings huge amounts of value to everybody. And if we get it right and we all maintain kind of this open mindset that we all have to collaborate, inclusive with the regulators and with governments, we'll really be in a position to see DeFi become an integral part of the financial ecosystem, not the kind of outlier that plays at the fringes where we only do these very specific use cases. We really want to see DeFi being useful for everyone in some way, shape, or form.
I think that's a really excellent point, and I really love how you have spoken about basically giving people a voice that wouldn't not normally have been able to have that voice. And an area I've observed that quite recently is we've seen a resurgence of discussion around the carbon impacts of blockchains and so forth. And what's encouraged me is to see, suddenly I've been observing these pop-up projects that just somebody comes up with an idea. One that comes to mind was the Klima algorithmic stablecoin that proposed to use tokenized carbon credits as stabilizing collateral. And I think that they had the idea on the Friday night. By the Saturday, they had a Discord of 1,000 people who were digging in deep and asking really, really, complex, difficult questions about how these markets operate in the traditional world, and how they can bring this sort of on-chain and be able to express potentially, various preferences around pricing externalities, basically, within the markets. I just wondered if anyone else had sort of observed anything particular in that carbon credit space, or had been involved in any projects, because I personally think that could be a really great area of, voluntary expression of preference.
I personally haven't, but I've seen a number of things that are looking to, I guess, solve some of these things. But I think to maybe go back to your earlier point for a second about accessing credit, debt financing is fine for certain things, but it's not usually really viable for highly experimental things, right? And I think that one of the key innovations, which maybe people don't quite get, and I think people don't like to talk about it too much as well because of the whole ICO thing and the association with token sales and stuff, but the ability, seniorage is maybe even better than equity as a financing mechanism, right? When you can make your own money and that money is tied to some outcome or some protocol or something like that, and that money can gain adoption and create its own ecosystem, that's an incredibly powerful driver and way to access financing for highly experimental things. And so when you look at something like, whether it's carbon credits or whatever other crazy idea someone has, the ability to sort of propose some model or some coordination game or some mechanism design, and then create a token that allows people to participate in that, is again very powerful. And I think it's something that is far more powerful than even traditional VC, right? Which is still highly gated, is very high barriers to entry, a lot of credentialism, as to who can access VC funding. DeFi and crypto allows anyone anywhere in the world who's got a credible idea to access financing extremely cheaply. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the innovation over the last 12 to 18 months has been so rapid.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's sort of like crowdfunding, but on a really global, accessible scale, I think is essentially what you're saying. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's crowdfunding on steroids.
Yeah. We've had a question from the audience. Is there a risk that traditional finance takes blockchain in-house on private protocols, leveraging the technical benefits but bypassing the decentralization? This is something I've thought a lot about, because obviously there's huge inefficiencies in markets that blockchains can help with, but that's not necessarily the exciting stuff. So Jack, how would you like to answer that?
I think it's an excellent question. I think there's a huge risk that traditional finance tries to take blockchain in-house on private protocols. Josh touched on this tension that exists. I think there's a lot of installed base interest in keeping the status quo, and yet obviously blockchain specifically has really threatened the way traditional finance has operated. We've been in both a recent fundraising and just through our normal course conversations, been talking with a lot of the traditional global custodians and large investment banks, and most of them have digital asset kind of SWAT teams looking at how this new technology is going to impact their future business. There are obviously a number of large global banks that have their own in-house protocols, whether it's the JP Morgan or the Citicoin, et cetera, that are trying to think about how they can transform or really re-platform their business. And what's missing is real interoperability between a lot of these different protocols. So on one hand, I think a lot of the incumbents would love to internalize as much future flow as possible with their own private chains and or protocols. while on the other hand, I think the industry is obviously pulling in a different direction to really decentralize much of what's existed in the past. So you're going to see, I think, this tension play out over time. And going back to a comment made earlier, it is hard and challenging, and we're seeing this as well, for regulated entities to also operate in a decentralized way. So if you just think about lend, borrow, that's a core business line for many traditional banks that are regulated, and there's a lot of legal compliance restrictions around how they lend out different assets to their customers. If you take that same bank and want to operate in a new digital asset ecosystem, how can you participate in a decentralized way if you still operate from a regulated base? I think there's going to be some very interesting challenges that these big organizations are going to have to overcome. And obviously the regulatory and legal landscape is still unfolding. So there aren't a lot of guideposts as to how to operate in the current, let alone in the future ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it does make me wonder, as we're going to have this emergence of public, protocols with large, active governance communities potentially, sort of the completely different mode of operating to, centralized entities and the way they fit within the regulatory structures. So it actually leads me on to another topic that I did want to speak about, which is about, I think it was about a month ago, Vitalik posted on a forum post, he just mentioned the need to build out the DGov ecosystem. And I thought, Kane, you've obviously done a lot on this and evolved some of the most, sort of forefront governance community in DeFi. Can you explain just to the audience, what is the governance in the context of DeFi? What are the types of decisions and sort of talk us through kind of what has worked and what hasn't worked and what's still being figured out?
Yeah, so I think, in terms of what has worked in DeFi so far, I think what we've seen is, apologies, my daughter's ready for bed and she's coming in, but she's going to be quiet and sit here patiently. So I think what has worked and what hasn't worked is oftentimes like parameterization. That's the thing that Isabel, please, I'm trying to talk. Parameterization is something that has worked quite well. When we're looking at, for example, Maker in the early days, most of the changes that they needed to make around like risk, adjustments and various other things were quite successful. As they got more into larger protocol changes, governance became much more challenging for them. And I think that, we've seen a few different models like Compound, for example, that have created like high barriers to entry for people to make governance changes. Things like, forcing people to actually have fully developed smart contract changes that they're going to deploy on chain before they're accepted as a governance proposal. And so I think that things like that can enforce some level of like rigor on the governance process. Within Synthetix, what we've done is created a delegated democracy. So we've got a council of people that are responsible for both of those things. So they're responsible for parameter changes to the protocol, and they're also responsible for major protocol changes as well. So when someone brings a proposal to, significantly change the protocol, they're responsible for both doing due diligence on it, verifying that the mechanism design and everything, will be sound when it's deployed on chain, and then validating that it's something that's in the best interest of token holders, whom they essentially represent. So I think that we've got a bunch of different approaches and a lot of experimentation that's going on. But probably the thing that I think that has been most successful has been the simplest things, which has been, let's change this risk parameter, let's change this. When we look at like wholesale changes of protocols, it's probably, we've got, I think, a few less success stories.
Interesting. And Vanessa, I guess you've probably had a lot of experience looking at, the early stages of projects trying to work out their governance approaches. Do you believe that the growth of DeFi is going to be quite tightly tied to the growth of developing out these governance experiments, as Kane has called them?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of teams being able to work together on a global basis, making decisions, they need actually the right tools to do that. And it's not just about defining the governments, it's how do you implement it, how do you follow up on it, how do you track it. And I think that's one of the core focus that we're looking at, is how can DAOs be effective in a world that's highly regulated, but that still needs a totally decentralized governance making. I mean, we spoke about the rise of Solana and other less decentralized platforms. So, what is our perspective for the future? Yes, you can go less decentralized to move quickly, but at the end of the day, the power of DeFi is a fully decentralized offering that makes it unstoppable, right? That is not just a few group of people that hold the reins of the protocol and puts it at risk at the end of the day. So failure in governance is going to be a key focus for the growth of DeFi, and addressing those mechanisms is going to really make or break the DeFi movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, do you have anything to add? Because I know that you guys are looking to transition to a DAO at some point soon. Yeah,
it's such an interesting topic of conversation. We could probably do another talk on DAO specific and DAO philosophizing. And the model that you employ from the outset is such a key decision, because it will, as Vanessa said, it will make or break how your community interacts with you. Some token holders kind of really resonate with this kind of direct democracy-like concept, where they themselves would like to have direct impact on certain decisions made. Others prefer, similar to what Kane has said, this more kind of representative model, where you have a council who have the responsibility delegated to them to represent underlying token holders in the community. So it is a really, really interesting piece of emerging thought that continues to kind of evolve, how DAOs can and should be governed depending on certain use cases. From a Qredo perspective, we're moving from a federated model where we have validators run by ourselves as well as third parties into a fully decentralized architecture, and they operate the nodes. And really then the question is how the validators themselves then team up and govern each other, but also the community of token holders, how they then contribute towards that governance. And we've got a lot of thinking to do, and we're receiving kind of crowd-funded, crowd-thinking insight into how to build this governance framework. And it's one of the next streams of upcoming kind of public debate that we would like to kick off. And it's such an early stage for the whole industry that I think we've got an enormous amount to learn. And we will be drawing upon the thought leadership of many people probably in this room, as well as the wider community.
Brilliant. Yeah, I completely agree that it's so critical to sort of evolving this sector. And we've actually only got a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to ask, if you're describing this DeFi era, this early DeFi era in 50 years' time, how might you talk about it? If we just quickly round the room, 10 seconds each. Vanessa.
So these 5 years, or 3 years around DeFi is really the first step of the experiment. And if we look back 50 years, we'll be in a totally different world in the way we engage with financial services, with companies, other economic actors, that will be powered by automated mechanisms like DeFi, but I think it will grow beyond DeFi, and it will percolate throughout our lives in every aspect of it.
Great, thank you. Kane?
I think we're in an inflection point, and I think when you look back historically, what's what was traditional finance will be seen as kind of Stone Age banging rocks together compared to what comes after it.
Yeah, I love that.
So I think it's going to be a pretty incredible 50 years.
Yeah, I agree. How about you, Jack?
Similarly, we're going through the vortex here, and there's no turning back. And we're going to think back and say, oh my gosh, how did the world ever exist like that before?
Yeah, Martin.
Yeah, I think looking back, I think DeFi will be the first use case where blockchain technology had something like real world impact, and has proven to be a use case where public decentralized networks make sense, and will be most likely be considered this kind of the first online store on Web 1.0 is DeFi for Web 3.0, I guess.
Great. Josh?
Yeah, I think at this moment we're building the foundation to make finance work for everyone, and so we're stripping out all of the middlemen to try and make it truly fair and accessible.
Wonderful. Thanks all of you for spending some time today. I'll hand back to Ian, and I've definitely learned a lot from all of you, and just thanks so much for your time and the generosity of your thought leadership.
Thank you so much, Tamlyn. Is there really any better way to start the morning than a great panel with some great names discussing DeFi? I think Josh really sums up how a lot of us feel at the start when he said, will DeFi eat TradFi? Yes, I believe it will. And will we just call DeFi Fi in the future? I think so. So thank you, Josh, Vanessa, Kane, Martin, and Jack. Up next, we conclude the DeFi segment with a deep dive on its backbone, stablecoins. This is the open web forum at CogX, curated by Fabric Ventures, and we'll see you back here in 19 minutes.